There are whispers in the dark you try so hard to ignore. Ancient stories buried by time, just waiting to be stirred. Tonight we delve into one such tale. Are you prepared to confront the truly inexplicable? If this journey into the shadows sends a shiver down your spine, and you crave more horrifying mysteries, let us know by hitting that like button. And to ensure you don't miss a single terrifying secret we're about to unleash, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Your presence here in the darkness is what keeps these stories alive. The summons to the Umberwood arrived via crackling late-night call from Julian. His voice, usually laced with academic ennui, now thrummed with a convert's zeal. He spoke of the forest not as a place, but as a surviving fragment of an older, purer world, a sanctuary untouched by the grinding gears of modernity, as he rather poetically put it. His obsession had been growing for months, fueled by obscure local histories and half-forgotten land surveys that hinted at a place intentionally left off the maps. Clara, ever the pragmatist, initially scoffed, but Julian's fervent descriptions of its unique ecology and rumored anomalies eventually piqued her scientific curiosity. Ben, always amenable, and perhaps seeking an escape from his own city-bound routines, needed little convincing. I, with my quiet, almost gravitational pull towards the uncanny, found myself agreeing before the call even ended. The prospect of experiencing such a place of breathing air supposedly untainted by centuries of human endeavor held a strange allure. Our journey to the forest edge was an exercise in itself, the final leg involving a bone-rattling drive down an unpaved logging track that seemed determined to shake our vehicle apart. When we finally parked, dusk was performing its slow, mournful ritual, painting the sky in bruised lavenders and somber grays. The Umberwood presented itself not with grandeur, but with a kind of ancient, weary intransigence. Its border was an indistinct, almost resentful line of gnarled, elderly trees. Their branches so tightly interwoven, they resembled the arthritic fingers of a skeletal hand, warding off intruders. Julian, alight with an almost feverish excitement, led us onto what he called a path. In reality, it was less a trail and more a subtle suggestion in the thick carpet of leaf litter, a whisper of passage that could have been made by deer as easily as by man. The air within the Umberwood was instantly different, heavy, preternaturally still, as if the forest held its breath. It carried the rich, loamy scent of perpetual damp earth, of decay and regeneration intertwined. But beneath that, another aroma, elusive at first, then more insistent, something subtly sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit on the verge of turning, or a funereal incense I couldn't quite place. For the first few hours, our conversation, though hushed, provided a fragile counterpoint to the deepening, almost sentient silence of the woods. We made camp in a small, unnaturally clear ingle nook, a circle of bare earth surrounded by towering trees that seemed to lean in, observing. Our fire, when Julian finally coaxed it to life, felt like a small, impertinent intrusion against the vast, encroaching dark. That first night, nothing overtly strange occurred, yet a profound sense of being watched settled upon us, a persistent, prickling awareness on the skin that no amount of rationalization could entirely dismiss. I found myself waking often, the sounds of the forest, the sigh of wind too high in the canopy to stir the lower branches, the scuttling of unseen creatures, amplified by the darkness, each one seeming to carry a hidden weight. Julian, however, was energized, speaking in hushed tones about ley lines and telluric currents. The next day he proposed we venture deeper. The accounts I found, he explained, his eyes gleaming, speak of a specific landmark, a place they called the Silent Gathering. It's said to be the heart of the Umberwood. His enthusiasm was infectious enough to override the tendrils of unease that had begun to coil around my own thoughts. The deeper we walked, the more the forest asserted its dominion. The trees, already ancient, grew denser, their forms more contorted and elaborate, trunks like a frozen torment. Sunlight became a rare, fractured commodity, filtering down in ethereal, dusty shafts that illuminated little. It was Ben who first noticed the effigies. He stopped abruptly, pointing. Hanging from a low, moss-laden branch was a small, intricately woven thing made of twigs, dried wildflowers, and what looked disturbingly like strands of pale hair. It was crudely human-shaped, featureless, yet possessed an undeniable, eerie watchfulness. Then we saw another and another, dozens of them appearing as our eyes adjusted, silent, primitive sentinels lining our path. Julian was thrilled, examining them closely, seeing them as profound cultural artifacts. Clara, however, found them deeply unsettling, her scientific detachment beginning to fray. I felt a similar disquiet, a sense that these were not mere decorations, but markers, or perhaps warnings. It was near what should have been sunset, though the oppressive canopy above us had long since swallowed any true sense of day. When we stumbled into the clearing, it wasn't a natural glade. A perfect circle of moss-covered stones, massive and clearly ancient, enclosed a space where the ground was trodden flat, hard-packed despite the otherwise untouched nature of the surrounding woods. And standing amongst the stones, or perhaps an integral part of them, their forms blending with the weathered surfaces, were figures. At first my mind struggled to categorize them. Unusually shaped tree trunks, elaborate abstract carvings weathered by centuries. They were utterly still, draped or formed from what seemed like woven bark, dried leaves, and thick strands of pallid fungus, their forms vaguely humanoid but unsettlingly elongated, their proportions subtly, disturbingly wrong. As our eyes strained in the gloom, we realized they were not static constructions of wood or stone. There was a yielding quality to their surfaces, like packed earth or a dense, fungal growth. They had no discernible faces, just smooth, shadowed indentations where features should have been. Yet from these hollows emanated an almost palpable regard. Julian stepped forward, his breath catching, his voice a low murmur of pure awe. The Silent Gathering. It's real. Clara's fingers dug into my arm, her nails biting. Jason, no, this isn't right. Let's go, please. Her voice was a thin, reedy whisper. Before Julian could respond, before I could articulate my own burgeoning dread, one of the figures shifted. It was a slow, deliberate, almost geological movement, like a root system reconfiguring itself within the earth, or a plant unfurling in time-lapse. Then another, with an infinitesimal sigh that might have been the wind, or something else. They weren't looking at us in any conventional sense, yet we felt an intense, focused attention, a psychic pressure that thickened the already heavy air. That's when Ben began to laugh. It wasn't his usual hearty chuckle, full of easy humor. This was a soft, continuous, almost blissful giggle, his eyes wide and unfocused, a strange, serene smile spreading across his face, a smile that seemed too wide for his features, pulling at the corners of his mouth in a way that was profoundly, hideously unnatural. He took a step towards the figures, then another, his movements fluid, almost graceful. "Ben?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling on the edge of a sob. "Ben, what are you doing?" He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear her, just continued his slow, smiling advance into the circle. Julian, too, had a peculiar expression plastered on his face, a look of dazed, ecstatic wonder. He reached out a hand, slowly, as if to touch one of the entities, his lips parted in a silent O. A cold dread, different from simple fear, a dread that spoke of irreversible change and loss of self, seeped into my marrow. This place, these beings, they weren't just observing, they were inviting or absorbing. The sweet cloying scent I'd noticed earlier was overpowering here, thick and almost suffocating, like the perfume of some monstrous carnivorous bloom. I saw Clara's eyes begin to glaze over, a faint, horrifying echo of Ben's vacant smile starting to form on her lips. Her resistance was visibly crumbling. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, cut through the fog of my own days. This was not discovery. It was consumption. I grabbed Clara's hand, yanking it hard. "We have to leave, now." My voice sounded harsh, alien in the profound stillness of the clearing. The pressure to stay, to surrender, to join that silent, smiling congregation was immense. A physical weight at my chest, a siren song in my mind. But the abruptness of my action, the raw fear in my voice, seemed to momentarily break the spell for Clara. Her eyes cleared a fraction, and a spark of genuine terror ignited within them, overriding the insidious calm. We turned and fled, stumbling back the way we came, crashing through the undergrowth with no thought for stealth or direction, only escape. We left Julian and Ben to their silent, smiling communion. Two more figures beginning their slow absorption into the Umberwood's ancient heart. We didn't dare look back. The forest itself seemed to resist our departure. Shadows deepened with unnatural swiftness, the trees themselves appearing to lean in, their branches snagging at our clothes like grasping claws, the very ground seeming to suck at our feet. The silence behind us was the most terrifying part, a silence that hummed with an ancient, unknowable, and utterly indifferent purpose. We broke free of the Umberwood's suffocating embrace as the first true clean light of dawn was staining the eastern horizon, the contrast between the forest's oppressive gloom and the open, breathing air almost painful. We collapsed by the side of the old logging track, gasping, scratched, and irrevocably changed. We never spoke, not in any detail of what happened to Julian or Ben. There were no bodies to find, no rational explanations to offer the mundane world beyond the tree line. They had simply become part of the Umberwood, another story, another secret absorbed by a place that had existed long before humanity's fleeting presence and would continue its silent, patient vigil long after we were gone, nurturing its uncanny congregation in the deep, whispering copse. The memory of their serene, too wide smiles would be our lifelong penance. It was Marcus who fixated on the Oswood River. He'd come across a brittle, hand-drawn map in a dusty antiquarian bookstore, a chart that depicted the region with unsettling vagueness, labeling vast swathes simply as unsurveyed, or, more ominously, here be silence. The Oswood itself was a jagged blue line snaking through this emptiness, and beside it, a tiny, almost illegible annotation. The Mire sings to the lost. This cryptic phrase had embedded itself in Marcus's imagination, overriding my own preference for more charted, less existentially threatening wilderness. He spoke of it with a kind of fevered reverence, a place where one might still touch the raw, untamed pulse of the world. I, admittedly, found a sliver of that allure compelling, despite a persistent undercurrent of unease. The initial days were a study in deceptive serenity, the kind that lulls you into a false sense of security before revealing its hidden teeth. We followed the Oswood's meandering course, its dark tea-colored water whispering secrets over smooth, algae-slicked stones. The forest crowding its banks was a dense, primeval tapestry of towering pine and skeletal birch, their branches so tightly interwoven that the sky was often reduced to a mere suggestion. The silence here was profound, not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, thick and watchful. About a mile downstream, where the riverbank softened into a muddy, reed-choked inlet, its banks stained with an orange, ferrous deposit, I found it. A tarnished silver locket, almost swallowed by the silt. It was heavy, intricately engraved with a swirling, non-representational pattern that seemed to shift if you looked at it too long. The clasp was broken, and it was empty, but as I held it, a faint, cold tingle traced its way up my arm, a feeling like old sorrow. Marcus, when I showed him, merely grunted, already preoccupied with scanning the tree line for signs of unusual flora. We dismissed it as lost property from a bygone era, though its cold weight in my pocket felt like a quiet memento mori. We made camp that evening, the fire a small, defiant ember against the ancient, crushing indifference of the woods. The following day, driven by Marcus's relentless curiosity about the Mire, we pressed further inland, a barely discernible game trail, more a subtle parting in the undergrowth than a true path, led us away from the immediate vicinity of the river, towards a low-lying area the antiquated map vaguely designated as Fenwick Mire. The trees here grew taller, closer, their upper branches forming a near-impenetrable canopy that plunged the forest floor into a perpetual submarine twilight. The air grew heavy, humid, and a faint, sulphurous odor began to permeate the usual scents of pine and damp earth. We came to a section of the river we hadn't seen before, or perhaps a tributary. The water here pooled, unnaturally dark and utterly still, reflecting the oppressive canopy like a polished obsidian mirror. Decaying wooden pilings, green with slime and age, jutted from the bank, like broken teeth, the only remnants of some long-abandoned landing or bridge. Marcus, ever the biologist, went to inspect a strange, luminous cluster of fungi clinging to a fallen log, its light a sickly, pale green in the gloom. I stood by the water's edge, inexplicably drawn to its opaque depths. A profound sense of unease, cold and heavy as a stone, settled in my chest. The air was utterly motionless, the silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. Then I saw it. Beneath the surface, a pale, indistinct shape wavered. It resolved, for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, into a face, or something that mimicked a face. Fatuous, serene with an ancient, imperturbable calm, its outlines blurred as if viewed through oil. It stared up at me from the black water. As I drew a sharp, involuntary breath, it seemed to smile, a slow, almost imperceptible parting of what might have been lips, before sinking deeper, dissolving back into the impenetrable blackness as if it had never been. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a submerged log casting an unusual shadow, my imagination kindled by the strange, oppressive atmosphere of the place. Shaken, I rejoined Marcus, who was frowning, his head cocked. "Did you hear that, Alex?" he asked, his voice hushed, a sort of wail, incredibly low and mournful, almost subsonic. Happened a moment ago, seemed to come from deeper in the mire, towards that stand of dead-looking aspens. I hadn't heard anything but the frantic thumping of blood in my own ears, the image of the subaquatic face seared onto my retinas. He seemed troubled by it, more than just curious, a rare shadow of fear touching his usually confident features. We decided, with a rare moment of mutual unspoken agreement, that the mire was not a place we wished to explore further that day, and turned back towards the perceived safety of the main river path. Later, however, our morbid curiosity, or perhaps some subtle influence of this place, drew us down a nearly overgrown track that branched off from our main trail, a path so faint it felt as if the forest was actively trying to erase it. It twisted for a good mile, the forest growing denser, the silence more complete, until it ended abruptly at a dilapidated cabin. It looked as if it had been surrendering to the relentless, silent siege of the wilderness for decades. Its timbers rotten, its roof caved in. A rank, gamey, and deeply unsettling odor hung heavy in the air around it. A smell of old blood and something else, something unpleasantly sweet. Against my better judgment and my vocalized protests, Marcus pushed open the groaning, protesting door. The interior was profoundly dark, windowless. Our flashlights cut wavering, nervous beams through the Stygian gloom, revealing a scene of primitive, visceral horror. Animal carcasses, in various states of decay, were strewn haphazardly across the dirt floor. Others, more disturbingly, hung from crude, sharpened wooden hooks, hammered into the log walls. Deer, boar, smaller unidentifiable creatures, their forms contorted. Bones, picked clean and gleaming faintly white, littered the floor like scattered kindling. There was a dreadful artistry to the arrangements, a sense of ritual that chilled me to the core. We backed out slowly, the silence of the forest now feeling less like peace and more like a bated, malevolent breath. As we hurried away, a sound ripped through the stillness, a long, guttural, blood-freezing shriek filled with a feral rage and a pain that was neither animal nor human. It seemed to echo directly from the violated sanctity of the cabin. That night, sleep was a fugitive, shallow thing, punctuated by nightmare visions of the cabin's interior, around what must have been the deepest, darkest hour of night. The sound Marcus had described earlier returned, that low, desolate wail, seeming to drift from the river, from the direction of the ominous mire. It grew in intensity, closer this time, unmistakably closer, before fragmenting into a series of sharp, distressed, almost bird-like cries that scraped at the nerves and made the hair on my arms stand on end. We had to know. Or perhaps some deeper, more primal instinct, some morbid compulsion cultivated by the forest itself, compelled us. Exiting the tent, our flashlights carving frantic, desperate arcs into the inky, suffocating blackness, we moved cautiously towards the riverbank. The wailing was disturbingly close now, seeming to emanate from just around the bend where I had found the locket, that place of muddy inlets and dark, still water. I turned to Marcus, a silent, desperate plea to retreat already forming in my eyes, and that's when I saw the figure standing motionless behind him. It was tall, impossibly unnaturally gaunt, its skin possessing the pale, unhealthy luminescence of a deep-dwelling fungus that has never seen the sun. Its limbs were elongated, insectile, ending in fingers that seemed too long, too slender, like bleached twigs. Its hair, if it truly was hair, hung in lank white riverweed-like strands, and its eyes, when it slowly turned its head towards me, were vast, empty pools of pearlescent white in the gloom. Before I could cry out, before Marcus could fully register my horrified expression and turn, one of its impossibly long arms shot out with reptilian speed and gripped his shoulder. The creature then let out that same feral, soul-tearing shriek we'd heard from the cabin, a sound of pure, unadulterated wildness and ancient hunger. With a speed and strength that utterly defied its emaciated frame, it pulled Marcus, who gave a single, choked, despairing cry, backwards. It didn't run along the ground. It moved into the trees, fluidly, impossibly, leaping from trunk to branch with nightmarish, silent agility, disappearing into the oppressive, vertical darkness of the canopy. Marcus's diminishing, terrified screams swallowed whole by the indifferent woods. Then, only the awful, profound, listening silence of the Oswood remained, broken by my own ragged, panicked gasps. I found my way back to what passed for civilization, though the path seemed to twist and fight me at every turn, the familiar landmarks dissolving into a disorienting green labyrinth. The authorities, with their crisp uniforms and tired, skeptical eyes, found no trace of Marcus, no sign of the cabin, no overgrown road leading to any mire such as I described. The place I depicted was, according to their meticulously detailed maps and generations of local knowledge, simply impassable, an area of ancient bog and impenetrable thicket that no one had reason to enter, or could, for generations. They spoke gently of disorientation, of the mind playing cruel tricks in such deep, isolating wilderness, of exposure and the regrettable, but not unheard of, phenomenon of lone hikers simply vanishing. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard. The Oswood and the black silent mire it cradles within its depths keeps its secrets well. It has an ancient, insatiable hunger, and sometimes it beckons with a song only the lost can truly hear. Sometimes that call is answered. The silver locket still feels cold in my pocket. I return to my parents' ancestral home on the fringes of the Stillwater woods, not out of sentiment, but a quiet, gnawing sense of displacement that had dogged me for nearly a decade in the sterile confines of the city. The house, a rambling two-story structure perpetually cloaked in the shadows of the ancient, sentinel trees, felt smaller, more compressed by the encroaching wilderness than I remembered. The woods themselves, however, seemed to have expanded, their presence more potent, breathing a silent, watchful energy that prickled at the edges of my awareness. My father, his face a road map of lines etched deeper by time and unspoken anxieties, had meticulously cleared 3 distinct paths into the forest, each originating from the overgrown back garden, their hand-carved signs weathered and greened with moss, read, King's Bolette, a relatively wide and inviting trail, Chanterelle Way, which looped pleasantly through a sun-dappled, when the sun deigned to appear, section of younger growth, and furthest to the left, almost hidden by a curtain of rhododendrons, a narrow, less trodden, and distinctly more somber track, named Dead Man's Thicket. On my first afternoon, a heavy, overcast sky leaching the color from the world, my father suggested a walk. The Bolette Trail is holding up well against the damp, he offered, his gaze, I noted with a faint stirring of unease, studiously avoiding any mention of the thicket. We walked. The silence between us filled more with unspoken thoughts than comfortable companionship. He spoke of mundane local matters, but his cheer felt brittle. We neared the trail's supposed terminus, a small stone-choked creek that gurgled with surprising vigor, but beyond it, almost entirely concealed by a dense curtain of weeping willows and tangled elder, another path continued. It was faint, almost spectral, bearing the hallmarks of recent, careful creation, yet imbued with an air of being deliberately, almost artfully, concealed from casual view. "What's that?" I asked, my voice louder than intended in the stillness. My father's jovial facade faltered for a moment. A flicker of something unreadable, akin to guardedness or perhaps old fear, passed through his eyes before he composed himself. "Oh, that. Just an overgrowth, son. Probably peters out into impassable bog. Besides," he glanced at the sky, which had darkened further, "it's getting late. Your mother will be starting to fret if we're not back for tea." He turned back with a forced briskness that didn't quite mask his relief. I lingered, my gaze fixed on that unfamiliar beckoning path, a strange pull emanating from his shadowed entrance. As I was about to follow him, a movement at the periphery of my vision, a figure, preternaturally swift and silent, melting from that hidden trail into the deeper, more impenetrable woods. It was too quick, too fleeting to discern details, but it was undeniably human-shaped, and its departure felt less like a startled retreat and more like a purposeful, conscious withdrawal. I mentioned it, trying to sound casual, as I caught up to my father. "Thought I saw someone on that other track." "Did you now?" He didn't break stride. "Probably just some local eccentric, a mushroom forager, perhaps. Folks around here have their odd ways, keep to themselves. Best not to pry, Jason. The Stillwater has always encouraged a certain privacy." His words were light, but the undercurrent was clear. That night, sleep was a shallow, troubled sea. The old house, far from the city's constant thrum, was alive with its own subtle orchestra. The sigh and groan of ancient timber settling, the dry rustle of unseen things in the walls, and beyond my window, the woods, a vast, impenetrable wall of absolute blackness. Breathing. I was drifting into a light, uneasy doze when a faint rhythmic tapping sound came from the window pane. Distinct, deliberate. Not a branch, not the wind. I sat bolt upright, heart suddenly a frantic bird against my ribs. Silhouetted against the faint, ghostly moonlight that managed to pierce the dense canopy were two shapes, sharp and pointed like alert animal ears, just visible at the very bottom of the window frame. They were utterly still for a heartbeat, then gone, not moved, didn't glide or fall, simply vanished as if the darkness had reclaimed them. I scrambled to the window, peering out into the oppressive gloom of the yard, but it was empty. The dew on the overgrown lawn undisturbed. Nothing indicated that there had been anything, or anyone, there. The next morning, the oppressive atmosphere of the previous night still clinging to me. I found my father standing by that same window in my room, his shoulders slumped, his expression uncharacteristically grim. In his hand, he held a small, instant photograph, its colors slightly washed out. "It seems our eccentrics were indeed about last night," he said, his voice low and gravelly. He handed me the photo. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, trickled down my spine. It was of me, asleep in my bed, turned towards the window, the image slightly blurred, as if taken by an unsteady hand, or in haste. The angle was low, unnervingly intimate, as if the photographer had been crouching just outside, in the damp grass. "There's more you need to see," he said, his voice heavy with a resignation I hadn't heard in him before. He led me to the living room, where my mother sat by the cold hearth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't meet my eyes. My father retrieved a small, worn, leather-bound album from a locked drawer in his antique desk. Its pages were filled with similar photographs, instant prints yellowing at the edges, taken over what must have been years. My parents, asleep in their bed, their faces vulnerable, unknowing. The house itself, captured from odd, unsettling angles, from deep within the trees. And then the pictures that made my breath catch. Photographs of figures in the woods, always at a slight distance, partially obscured by foliage or shadow. They wore masks, stylized, deeply unsettling representations of forest creatures. A gaunt-faced owl with eyes like shadowed pits, a fox with features too sharp, too intelligent, a stag with an overabundance of intricately carved bone-white tines. Their own eyes, barely visible through the narrow slits, were dark, unreadable, and devoid of any discernible emotion. These weren't playful disguises. They were ritualistic, totemic, imbued with an ancient, unnerving power. Who are they? I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper, the cold dread solidifying into a knot in my stomach. The Keepers, my mother breathed, her voice thin as spun glass. They've always been in the Stillwater woods, or perhaps the woods have always been theirs. My father continued, his gaze fixed on a particularly unsettling image of the owl mask. There are understandings, boundaries, respected for generations. They watch. Usually that's all they do. But your return, Jason, it seems to have stirred them from their usual quietude, disrupted a pattern. He looked at me then, a deep, searching, almost fearful gaze. Jason, try to remember. Anything at all about a covenant path, or a promise made, perhaps an oath taken, near the old standing stone. It would have been deep within the thicket, the summer before you left for college all those years ago. The words, the place names, resonated with a disturbing, subterranean familiarity, yet no concrete memory surfaced. A standing stone, a promise. My recollections of that last summer were a blur of restless energy, of anticipated departure, nothing more sinister. Yet the mention of Dead Man's Thicket now sent an inexplicable, almost visceral chill through me, a sense of forgotten obligation. My parents exchanged a glance. They believe, my father said, his voice heavy with unspoken history, that certain bonds, once forged with the Stillwater, or with them, must be acknowledged, periodically renewed, especially by those who carry a particular lineage, a deep-rooted connection to this land, this house, that goes back further than written record. Later that day, drawn by an irresistible compulsion I couldn't explain, I found myself at the entrance to the Dead Man's Thicket trail. It was palpably darker here, the air colder, stiller. The path twisted deeper into the woods than I had anticipated, the trees older, more gnarled, their branches forming a suffocating roof. Eventually, it opened into a small, unnaturally silent, circular clearing. In its precise center stood a single, lichen-encrusted, moss-covered standing stone, taller than a man, its weathered surface covered in faint, eroded spiral carvings and symbols I couldn't decipher, but which pulsed with a latent energy. As I stood before it, trying to quiet the sudden chaotic thumping of my heart, a flicker of movement at the absolute edge of the clearing. 3 figures, masked, as in the disturbing photographs, the owl, the fox, the stag. They didn't approach, didn't speak, didn't make a sound. They simply stood, watching, their utter stillness more unnerving, more potent than any overt threat. And as I looked at them, at their ancient, impassive masks, a fragment of memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, surfaced from the depths of my forgotten past. My younger self, barely 19, standing in this very clearing, a hand outstretched towards the cold stone, a voice, my own, yet unfamiliar, speaking words I couldn't quite recall, but feeling as profound, almost sacred, and deeply unsettling obligation. The air had smelled then, as it did now, of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something ancient, something that demanded observance, a silent pact. The figures slowly raised their hands, palms open, in a gesture that was not quite a greeting, nor entirely a warning. It was an acknowledgement, a confirmation of a silent, binding contract. The light in the clearing was fading fast. I knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had been here before, and that my return had not gone unnoticed by the masked keepers of Stillwater Trail. The woods remembered, even if I had desperately, perhaps purposefully, tried to forget. And they, the silent sentinels, expected something in return for their long, patient watch, a debt I now sensed was finally coming due. Ilara and I shared a fascination with places that seemed to exist outside the neatly drawn lines of the modern world. It was this shared curiosity that led us to the Grossenwald, a forest in a remote, sparsely populated region, whispered about in local taverns as a place with a long memory and a habit of holding on to things. We hired a local guide, Kyle, an old man with eyes like chipped flint, who claimed to know its hidden paths and its deeper secrets. The Grossenwald swallowed us whole within an hour. The trees, firs, and ancient broad-limbed oaks stood so densely packed that daylight became a diffuse, greenish twilight, even at noon. Kyle, surprisingly spry for his age, led us deeper, his voice a low drone as he recounted tales of the forest, of travelers who walked in circles for days, of sounds that mimicked familiar voices, of a peculiar stillness that could unmoor the mind. There are old markers in the deep woods, he said, his gaze distant. Stones with scratchings from forgotten tongues. They speak of the Waldgeist, the spirit of the wood, and of those who become entangled. It was on the second day, far from any discernible trail, that we found it. Not a hanging victim, but something almost as disquieting. In a small clearing, dominated by an unusually twisted, ancient pine, was a figure. It was man-shaped, constructed entirely of woven branches and what looked like dried moss, its limbs contorted. But beneath the weave, through gaps, we could glimpse something that looked disturbingly like bone and desiccated, leathery skin. It wasn't bound or hanging. It was simply placed there, seated at the foot of the pine, head bowed, as if in permanent, sorrowful contemplation. Around its base, a ring of small, smooth stones were laid, and one larger, flat stone bore faint, spidery etchings. An offering or a warning? Ilara murmured, her voice hushed. Kyle squinted at the etchings. The old script is hard to read. Something about those who wander beyond the echo lose their legs, but never their path here. He shook his head. The meaning is lost to time. Just old fears. We pressed on, though the image of the silent woven sentinel stayed with me. The air grew heavier, the silence more profound. Kyle mentioned a clearing further ahead, a place with a freshwater spring where we could make camp for the night. He said it was perhaps another mile. It was some time later, as the perpetual twilight deepened further, that Coil stopped us. I felt a prickle of unease. Ilara's eyes met mine, a silent question in them. "Stay here," Kyle whispered, his gaze fixed on something unseen ahead. "I will return shortly." The silence he left behind was immense, broken only by the faint creak of branches high above, like the hinges of a vast, unseen door. "What do you think it is?" Ilara asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, a strange sense of weariness washing over me. "But we should wait for him." "You trust him?" "For the fee we paid, I suppose we must." A cool breeze rustled the canopy, and the shadows of the towering trees seemed to writhe and stretch, their forms momentarily finger-like, curling inward. Then the sound of snapping twigs announced Kyle's return. "All right," he began, his voice holding a note of something I couldn't quite place. "You came to see the deeper parts of the Grossenwald, yes? The unsettling aspects." "Yes," Ilara replied, a tremor in her voice. "Then you are about to. It is unusual. If you prefer, there's another way, longer, but—" "No," Ilara said, and I heard my own unspoken agreement in her tone. "We want to see." Kyle led us around a dense thicket that had obscured our view, and there it was. In a small clearing, seated at the foot of an ancient, twisted pine, was a figure woven of branches and moss, head bowed. A ring of stones, a larger, flat stone with etchings. A cold wave washed over me, so intense I felt dizzy. "Kyle," I began, my voice hoarse. Didn't we just have this conversation? See this?" He looked at me, his flinty eyes unreadable. The forest plays tricks on the senses when one is tired. Ilara was pale. "No," she said slowly. "He's right. The way you stopped us, what you said, it was identical." Kyle offered no further explanation, merely gestured for us to continue. The next hour, or perhaps it was 3, time in the Grossenwald had become elastic, unreliable, was a blur of mounting dread. Every remark, every pause, every rustle of leaves began to feel familiar, like a script I was doomed to repeat. My attempts to deviate, to ask different questions or suggest a different path, were met with Kyle's placid insistence on the route, or Ilara's strangely compliant agreement, as if she too were caught in the loop but not yet fully aware of its bars. We discovered the woven figure twice more. Each time, my protestations grew weaker, my sense of reality more frayed. My memory of the initial encounter became indistinguishable from the repetitions, each iteration layering over the last, creating a seamless, horrifying present. I am writing this down, scratching it onto the last pages of my journal with a dwindling pencil during one of the rests Kyle insists upon. Ilara sits nearby, staring blankly at the unchanging pattern of the trees. Kyle hums a tuneless, repetitive melody. I don't know how many times we have walked this particular stretch of the Grossenwald, how many times he has returned to tell us of the unsettling aspect ahead. The forest is not a place. It is a mechanism, a verdant coil that tightens with each repetition. The sweet resinous scent of pine is now the smell of my prison. I fear the clearing with the spring will never be reached. We are the new things the Grossenwald is holding on to, destined to wander beyond the echo, losing ourselves but never our path here, whatever that truly means. The inscription makes a horrifying kind of sense now. We are becoming entangled. Liam and I were drawn to whispers of Ashworth House, a dilapidated manor swallowed by the Blackwood forest, a place local tongues fell silent about. The townsfolk, when pressed, would only offer vague warnings about old ways and a place best left to its shadows. Such reticence was, to us, an irresistible lure. We considered ourselves amateur historians of the forgotten, seekers of places where the veil between then and now felt thin. The forest itself was a brooding preamble. Ancient gnarled trees clawed at a perpetually overcast sky, their dense canopy creating a premature twilight. After hours following a barely there track, Ashworth House emerged from the gloom, a hulking silhouette of decaying grandeur, its windows like vacant eyes. The air around it was cold, carrying the scent of damp stone and something else, a faint, metallic tang that pricked at the back of the throat. The massive oak front doors, though weather-beaten and scarred, were unlocked. They opened with a surprising lack of sound, as if recently tended, admitting us into a vast, dust-sheeted hall. Shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs, and our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the oppressive silence. For a house supposedly abandoned for generations, there was an odd sense of order beneath the decay. Tools leaned neatly against a wall in one room. A path was cleared through the debris in another. Our exploration led us deeper, past rotting tapestries and portraits whose subjects' eyes seemed to follow us. It was in what might have once been a scullery or pantry, a room colder than the rest, that we found the first anomaly, a heavy bolted door, newer than its surroundings, set into a stone wall. An iron grate was set into its upper half. Liam, ever the bolder, produced a sturdy pry bar from his pack. The bolts, though thick, yielded with a groan of strained metal. Beyond was not a storeroom, but a narrow corridor, descending slightly. The metallic tang was stronger here, mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies and something akin to stale incense. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, dimly lit by a sliver of high window crusted with grime. Lining the walls were cages, not animal pens, but crude metal enclosures, large enough for a person. Most were empty, their doors ajar, thick with rust and cobwebs. But one, at the far end, was closed, and from within came a faint, rustling sound. A low moan, barely human, drifted from the cage as we approached. Inside on a bed of straw lay a figure, gaunt, clad in rags, their face obscured by a fall of matted hair. Their limbs were skeletal, and the visible skin was pale and marked with sores. "Help." The word was a dry, cracked whisper. They keep the balance. Before we could process, before we could ask who they were, a shadow fell across the doorway at the end of the corridor through which we'd entered. Standing there were two individuals, their forms bulky in the dim light, their faces obscured by deep hoods made of rough, dark cloth. They moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that spoke of long habit. One carried a heavy knotted staff. Liam tensed beside me. "We're just looking," he said, his voice attempting a confidence it didn't possess. "We didn't mean any harm." The figures said nothing. The one with the staff took a step forward. The silence in the chamber was absolute, save for the ragged breathing of the captive and our own suddenly loud heartbeats. "The Ashworth legacy requires participants," a voice rasped from beneath one of the hoods, a voice dry as autumn leaves. "The forest provides, the house preserves. The balance, as you heard, must be maintained." We understood then. This wasn't abandonment. It was a hidden stewardship, a continuation of something ancient and terrible. The warnings of the townsfolk, the strange order amidst the decay, the silent welcome of the oiled doors. It all clicked into a horrifying pattern. We hadn't discovered a forgotten ruin. We had trespassed upon a living, breathing shrine to some dark, unspoken creed. The figure with the staff, gestured towards an empty cage, its door creaking slightly as if an invitation. The other hooded figure moved to block the corridor. There was no anger in their movements, no malice in their unseen eyes, just a calm, inexorable certainty. We were not explorers here. We were ingredients, destined for the penance of Ashworth House, to become part of its shadows and its silence, another offering to the insatiable balance it served. The forest had indeed provided.